The second fundamental aspect of CSS that we will cover in this section is the box model, practically irreplaceable when creating websites. After getting acquainted with the box model, we will be able to arrange all the elements on our websites however we want in no time. Each HTML element displayed on a website is a rectangle. Each rectangle has two properties that define it, the height and the width. To control the size of an element in CSS with the width and the height properties, this element must be recognized by the browser as the block element. If this is not the default value, we can give the element the display block property. The box model applies to each element. The box model applies both to the inline and the block elements, but as we know already, it's much easier to modify its properties when dealing with the block elements. Let's see the box model on a specific example. Here you can see a div element. This element has several properties that defines its box. More specifically, the 5 basic properties related to the box model: width, height, padding, border, and margin. In the very center of the box, we have a space for content, the so-called content box, in which there is a text or an image. By default, the width and the height properties define the size of the content box. The next layer of our box is padding, so the space separating our content from the edges of the box. We can think of it as an inner margin that is part of our box. At the end, there is a border on every edge of our box. Additionally, we have a margin on the outside of our box. Margin is not the part of our box, but it affects its position on our website, moving our box away from the other elements or from the edges of the browser window. Note that by default, padding and border add up to our element's base height and width, increasing its size. We can freely define the size of our box if we are dealing with a block element. Here we can see clearly that the height and the width specified in the CSS rule applies only to the content box and does not take into account the padding and the border. So when placing such an element on our website, we will have to remember that the actual size of the box, which is our whole element, will be larger by the padding and the border values. Specifying the height and the width to a stiff value set in pixels will prevent this element from expanding if its content increases. Even if we add more text to it, its width will remain 200 pixels and its height will remain 100 pixels. As we can see on this slide, we increased the font size of our content text to 120 pixels. The content of our box does not fit inside it and stands out beyond it. Interestingly, it does not destroy the box in any way. Its content is simply visible beyond its border. The content outside the box is usually a negative phenomenon. The page structure does not change, but the images and the text are overlapping and stand out of their container borders. The structure of the page is still intact, but its appearance layer is covered by the standing out elements, which does not look aesthetically pleasing. To keep something not visible outside the box, we can give the box the overflow hidden property. Padding is then the limitation for the content. The content is not visible beyond the padding. So when our content is bigger than our box, it's just simply getting cropped so that it does not stand outside the element's border. Another important issue related to the box model is determining its maximum width and height. By establishing such a property, our box will increase with the content until it reaches the maximum value. In this case, 200 pixels of its width and 200 pixels of its height. In addition to the maximum values of the height and the width of the element, we can also set their minimum values. Then our element will have at least as much height or width as we specify, or more if its content requires it. As we know, we can declare the padding with one property, by giving the several values for each side of the box, or use the separate properties for each side. We also don't have to declare all the values. As in this example, if we don't want the right side padding, we don't need to declare it. Then the value for padding right is 0. You can think of the padding as the inner margin, so the space separating our content, which is most often the text, from the edges of the box. Also note that the padding takes the background color from the content by default. In the presentation, the padding is colored in a different way for illustrative purposes only. In fact, by default, the content box and the padding box have the same background color. The margin moves our element away from the other elements or from the edges of the browser window. It is not part of our box, it is outside, but it affects the position of our box in the space of the website. The margin does not take over the background color of our box because it is on the outside. We declare the margin in the same way as the padding, with one property with several values for each side, or with separate properties for each side of the box. Now I want to mention some interesting behavior of the margin property. We have two elements next to each other, both with some margins. The left and the right margins add up, so the distance between the elements on this slide will be 35 pixels. Sounds logical. It would seem that the margin top and bottom behave the same. That 20 pixels of margin bottom of the first element would be added to the 30 pixels of the margin top of the second element, and the space between these elements would be 50 pixels. But unfortunately, this is not what's going to happen. The space between the elements is determined by a larger margin. In this case, it is the margin top of the second element, which is 30 pixels. It is worth remembering this. Margin top and margin bottom do not add up. The margin can also be negative, which we can see on this slide. We usually use minus values for the margin property when we want to manipulate the content of our element in a different way than usual. I will show this in practice so you can see it better. Using the margin property, we can also center our element horizontally. Setting the auto value on both sides of the box on the left and the right, we will center it relative to the parent. However, this doesn't work for margin top and margin bottom, so we won't center the element vertically this way. If we use the auto value in the margin property only on one side of the element, all the free space will be used as the margin for that side of the element. In practice, we will move our element to the edge of the parent element on the left or the right side. The last outer layer of our box is the border. We can treat the border as the frame of our element. It can be defined shortly with the border property name, with provided several values related to its width, style, and color. We can also define each of these aspects of the border with a separate property. The style, color, and width of our border may be different for each side of the element. However, we need to use separate properties for each aspect of the border for this, giving values for each side of the element. The short border property will not work in this case. Interestingly enough, under our border, there is also the background color. It is not visible under the solid border, but it's visible under dotted and dashed styles. We are getting to know more and more properties that we will use in our CSS rules. Therefore, it is worth learning about the good practices of placing these properties in terms of their importance of the presentation and the appearance of elements on the website. From the technical point of view, it does not matter at all, but it does from the point of view of the code readability. You as the developer will return to the certain rules many times, and thanks to following a few simple principles, you will easily find the property you want to change in a given rule. We write the properties from the most important to the least important. First, the properties about the position and display of the elements. because such changes are the most important in terms of how this element works and how it behaves on our website in relation to the other elements. Then we define the properties related to the box model of our element. At the very end, we put the least important properties, so those that are related only to the appearance of our element. I will follow these principles throughout this course in my projects, so you will get these habits quickly as well. But that's all for this part of the theory, and now let's move on to some practice.